Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Killorn, and I'm the CEO of the Immigrant Council of Ireland. We're going to give just a couple of minutes to allow everybody to come into the session that we've just started sharing live. It's also live on Facebook, on our Facebook page for Immigrant Council of Ireland, if you'd like to join there alternatively. But we will just give 1 second now for participants or members of the public to join. Okay, we're up to almost 100 people viewing this morning, and I believe there's close to 200 registered, so we'll allow people to join. But I will kick off this morning's proceedings. As I said, I'm Brian Killorn, and I'm the CEO of the Immigrant Council of Ireland. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to the first session in our week-long series of workshops and panel discussions and events to mark our National Integration Conference in the Immigrant Council of Ireland for 2021. Our 2020 conference was unfortunately parked due to the COVID restrictions, and we moved our operations online in the meantime. So it's great to join you all here today, and great to be able to do it in this medium. I suppose from my own perspective, my own interest in this area of interculturalism and diversity began about 19 years ago when I worked as a facilitator for a program in Boston, in Massachusetts, where teachers from the Middle East and North Africa came to the US on a summer training program. I was there to help facilitate the group and had many positive experiences, but one that really stood out to me was watching teachers from Israel and Palestine who in their normal lives would seldom get a chance to interact with one another on a human level, but in this environment connected in a very profound way. They had the opportunity to see each other on a human level and see the connection they shared as opposed to the division that marked so much of their lives. When the course was over, they embraced each other, and there was a few tears shed because they knew that they were returning to a situation where this connection would once again be severed by physical and political barriers, the barriers of conflict. That experience taught me that even in the most divided of circumstances, if people really see each other as human beings, and if they can look into each other's eyes and see themselves reflected in that other person, any division, no matter how entrenched, can be overcome. And that's an ideal that I've tried to carry with me, and one that I think informs so much of our work in the Immigrant Council. For 20 years now, we've worked with and for migrant communities in Ireland in the areas of legal support and information, political mobilization and education, leadership and capacity building, integration planning at national and local levels, anti-racism, and many other areas. We've also worked with some of Ireland's most marginalized groups in relation to migrant women who've experienced domestic violence, situations of human trafficking, and we do a lot of legal work in support of unaccompanied minor children. This work continues to be a privilege and an environment in which we continue to learn on a daily basis. We are delighted throughout the course of our conference this week, starting this morning, to provide a platform where conversations can take place on some of the most important issues on the topic of integration in Ireland, where we can reflect and connect on what needs to be done to embed equality into our society and to truly see the humanity behind the story of migration, diversity, and change in Ireland. This diversity makes the question of Irish identity now, nearly 100 years after the foundation of the state, a very pertinent one, and one that we must guide and imbue with values of inclusion, equality, and respect. This morning we have many great panelists to guide and inform our discussion. We're delighted to have Sarah Duku, who's the Carja coordinator based in Balbriggan in Dublin. She's an advocate for migrant rights with vast experience working in community development sector in Ireland. She's a mother of two and a graduate of the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. a board member of Balbriggan Integration, and a vice chair of the South Sudanese Community Association of Ireland. We're also delighted to have Ciara Murphy from Maastricht University and currently based in Geneva. Ciara has a bachelor's degree in law and French from Trinity College Dublin and a double master degree in public policy and human development, specializing in migration studies from Maastricht University. Her master's thesis was the evaluation of the reliance on civil society for the delivery of integration supports to refugees and asylum seekers in Ireland, which is a very pertinent topic for us this morning. We're also joined by Dr. Amanullah Dasandi from UCC. He's the senior lecturer and chair of race and equality in UCC, and also a director of the organization NASC down in Cork. Dr. Amanullah is head of the study of religions department, senior lecturer in contemporary Islam and chair of the Race Equality Forum at University College Cork. Has also taught Islamic studies at Ithaca College and the University of Miami in the USA, and is an affiliate of the University of Glasgow's Theology and Religious Studies Department in Scotland. So, as I say, we are also very pleased to be joined this morning by Minister Joe O'Brien, a former ICI colleague and now Minister of State for Community Development and Charities. There'll be a keynote from the Minister in a couple of minutes, followed by a panel discussion with our expert panelists. This morning's theme is integration, learning from the past and looking at the future. For those viewing the webinar, there is a Q&A box, so please do submit your questions and we'll keep a space at the end of our discussion for putting questions to our panelists. You may hear some points this morning and throughout this week, indeed, that you may disagree with, such as the nature of conversation, and the world would be a very boring place if we all agreed with one another all the time. But we ask that the conversation and the questions this week be maintained with a spirit of mutual respect and understanding that we all share a common goal, and that goal is ultimately equality. I'm also delighted to hand you now over to the chair of the Immigrant Council of Ireland, Dr. Roja Fazeli, who will welcome you to this morning's session and then introduce the minister in a second. Dr. Fazeli is the Assistant Professor of Islamic Civilizations at Trinity College Dublin and Warden of Trinity Hall, a residential learning community of 1,000 students. Roja has published widely on the subject of Islamic feminisms, female religious authorities, women's rights in Iran, and the relationship between human rights and religion. She's also a fantastic chair of the Immigrant Council of Ireland. So I will hand you over to Roja now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. In beginning my remarks, I would first like to thank Theresa, Integration Manager, Valeria, Integration Officer from the Integration team, and also Robert, who's the Digital Communication and Fundraising Manager. All of whom I know have worked, as always, incredibly hard to bring this wonderful event together. 2020 was a difficult year. According to a UNHCR report, an estimated 79.5 million people remained forcibly displaced due to persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or events seriously disturbing public order. COVID has only heightened these dynamics. In Ireland, we too are living with ongoing challenges of this global pandemic. And I want to acknowledge this morning that I recognize how difficult it is to be conferring over these matters at such a distance from each other, and with many of us likely facing our own unique stresses during this time. I am reminded again as a result how important community cohesion is, in particular with regard to migrant communities. I know that a considerable percentage of our community have been frontline and essential workers during this time, in both healthcare and retail settings. And I think it's important to acknowledge and applaud that. Ireland in 2021 is a much more diverse place than it was when I arrived in 1992. I've seen this increase in diversity largely welcomed as Ireland continues to be open to learning new things. At the same time, I've also seen, on the whole, a strong community of culture that is similarly to be celebrated. The endurance of tight community cohesion, surpluses of local trust, and a readiness to embrace equality with unique good humor are all deeply Irish qualities that I have come to love. I want to strongly suggest that the preservation of culture and an openness to new people and experiences are not necessarily things in opposition to each other. And I think that Ireland's general and habitual ethic of inclusiveness demonstrates this well. However, gathered as we are for a discussion on Irish identity and integration, it would also be irresponsible not to acknowledge the challenges that Irish identity faces in a changing world. Institutional structures such as direct provision continue to disfigure Ireland as a place of welcome. And our country's openness to others also means a porousness to trends of xenophobia and nationalism that are increasingly pronounced within partner nations and neighboring states. Thinking of future generation, one specific challenge stands out to me in particular. Even while Ireland tops the EU OECD charts for reducing educational inequality amongst children, second-generation immigrants here continue to have trouble achieving good educational outcomes at the same rate as countries such as the UK. All of these are issues that Immigrant Council of Ireland is working hard to address to change. This conference is one more step in that direction as we bring together national and international experts in the area of migration. Across this week, we will reflect on diversity, integration, and Irish identity through themes such as employment, Black excellence, anti-racism, and leadership. The aim is to share ideas, identify positive actions, and promote effective migrant integration. After almost a century of legally recognized nationhood and self-government, Ireland continues to develop as a vibrant multicultural society. 1 in 8 of us are people of migrant background, and we have a growing number of people born in Ireland to mixed heritage parents. A significant occasion to celebrate occurred in June 2020 when Councillor Hazel Chu was elected as Lord Mayor of Dublin. Yet 2020 also saw important and necessary Black Lives Matter protests taking place in Ireland, demands for action against racism, and continued advocacy for immediate changes to the mean system of direct provision. National and international reports highlighted systemic issues with regard to labor market integration in Ireland, and access to Irish citizenship also remains an issue for many, with lengthy processing times and high processing fees that can be prohibitive to full integration. These and many other issues demonstrate that Ireland still has a long way to go to become a country that is truly inclusive of migrants and their families. With the imminent expiry of Ireland's first migrant integration strategy in 2021 and the unexpected challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are in a unique position now to reflect on the Irish approach to integration to date, and also to discuss future directions that will ensure that Ireland remains on the right track and that no one of us is left behind. In that regard, we are very fortunate that Minister of State for Community Development and Charities, Joe O'Brien, is able to join us today. I know that Minister O'Brien has been an advocate for human rights all of his professional life, both at home and abroad. He has carried out influential research, policy, and advocacy work on minority access issues to the social protection and homelessness system. Some of it notably as a project manager and integration policy analyst for Immigrant Council of Ireland. As a formal whistleblower on the undercounting of homelessness, Mr. O'Brien is also a strong advocate for greater transparency in public and political life. It's a pleasure, therefore, to welcome him as our keynote speaker for the Irish Integration Conference. Joe, you're very welcome, and I'm also delighted to open the Irish National Integration Conference.
Thank you very much, Rosa. There certainly have been many, layers of strangeness in life over the last 12 months, and indeed the last 15 months for me personally. 15 months ago, Brian was my boss, of course, and I had a normal job with the Immigrant Council of Ireland. And apart from going through 2 elections in the intervening period, becoming a member of government and becoming a Minister of State. We are all, of course, living in a dramatically changed world, a world at war in many respects with the coronavirus, a strange world where we see and interact with each other so much via these screens in front of us. But amidst this strangeness this morning, I do feel a sense of being with friends, and it's nice to see some familiar faces and names on the schedule for the events during the week as well. So it's a genuine pleasure to be with you all this morning, albeit virtually. Before I address the theme I was given today of learning from the past and looking to the future, I think it's important for me to outline my remit, as I do think it will be helpful and useful to you all going forward. As stated already, I'm Minister of State with responsibility for community development and charities. These responsibilities cross 2 government departments, Department of Rural and Community Development and the Department of Social Protection. I'll touch on some of the areas of responsibility that I think are of particular relevance to today. Just give me a minute. Possibly of most relevance is the state's main social inclusion programme, or SICAP, which is under my remit. And SICAP stands for Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme. This operates via 33 local development companies across the country, which have support specifically targeted at migrants, asylum seekers and refugees through a variety of interventions, from personal development, education, employment, cultural events, or to setting up their own business as well. These supports are not necessarily framed or named as integration supports, but in practice that is exactly what they do. SICAP supports about 10,000 migrant asylum seekers, refugees on an annual basis, and next month we will be launching a report on the barriers faced by migrants as they have presented to SICAP programs across the country. Another aspect I oversee is volunteering, and I launched the first national volunteering strategy in December. And one of the aims of the strategy is to diversify the volunteer population in Ireland. But there's already some significant progress in this regard, and indeed some volunteer centres in Ireland have a very high percentage of migrant volunteers on their books, and I think this fact needs to be broadcast and it's not widely known. Also at an immediate and interpersonal level and community level, I think there's a huge role that volunteering can play in promoting integration, not just with helping migrant volunteers find a doorway into their wider community, but also to facilitate positive and productive interactions between migrants and Irish people. There is a volunteer centre in every county in Ireland, so please spread that word. And I want to thank Volunteering Ireland in particular for the great work they are doing in this regard. Another area that I have oversight of is our public participation networks. These are local forums that bring volunteer-led groups in each local authority area from the community and voluntary sector, environment sector and social inclusion sectors together. Their primary purpose is to enable the PPN member groups to input into and have their voices heard within the formal decision-making structures of the local authority. Migrant integration was actually factored into PPNs from the very beginning, and the report that recommended their establishment specifically stated that public participation should not be restricted to the local community or indeed citizens, and that Ireland should provide for public participation without discrimination as to citizenship, nationality or domicile. PPNs are free to set their own agenda and focus on whatever issues they choose, and some PPNs have chosen to give migrant integration a special focus. To give one example, Clare PPN worked with the local community to initiate and support a community welcome group in Milltown Malbay, where an emergency centre for international protection applicants opened. Another key area that I oversee is the 5-year strategy for the community and voluntary sector, and also a key financial support package for the sector called the Scheme to Support National Organisations, which some of you would be familiar with. This provides some core funding on a multi-annual basis to over 70 NGOs nationally from a wide variety of areas, but includes the broad area of integration as well, and indeed Immigrant Council, Refugee Council, New Communities Partnership, ENR and Akidwa, for example, coming under that scheme. And then finally, just in terms of kind of key areas of responsibility, I do have some areas of responsibility as part of social protection as well. I oversee community employment schemes and the National Social Inclusion Roadmap, which has some very relevant objectives related to migrant integration. And under that remit, we will be hosting the National Social Inclusion Forum in April in a format similar to this as well. There are a whole lot of other relevant areas as well, such as philanthropy, social innovation, community services programme that I could talk about that are under my remit, but I just wanted to pick out them key areas because I felt it would be useful considering the audience today. I do also, as Rosa did, want to briefly reflect on the pandemic. And I think it's very, very important to acknowledge the fact that a disproportionate amount of the frontline workers during the pandemic have been migrants or people of a migrant background. Migrants have been saving the lives of people in Ireland on a daily basis since this pandemic started. And without them, we would have been in a catastrophe of an even more unfathomable scale in Ireland at the moment. This, of course, is very much the case in the health service, where so many staff of a migrant background work. And indeed, it must always be remembered that some have given their lives in the battle to save others. We don't have all their names, but one we do have is Dr. Syed Wakar Ali, who contracted COVID-19 last year and died. This was in the course of these efforts to save others from the virus. And I feel very strongly that Ireland owes migrants a huge debt for the role they have played during the pandemic. Now, I suppose, to address the theme, learning from the past and looking towards the future. And I'll do so broadly under kind of four headings: immigration system, inequality, political participation, and racism. And anytime I try to get my head around what we could be doing better in Ireland as regards migrant integration, I always go back to a rights-based approach. And as a starting point, if you are trying to build an equal society where everyone has the same opportunities, everyone needs to have the same rights, at least on paper, as a starting point. And so the challenge to migrant integration takes an immediate hit, not just in Ireland, but in most other countries of migration, as we generally only allow migrants to live in Ireland, at least initially, with a set of diminished rights. Practically speaking, of course, this is what the immigration system does. We're all born with the same set of fundamental rights, but immigration systems do this strange thing of insisting that if you want to live in another country, that country will take some of these rights from you, at least on a temporary basis. And in terms of learning from the past, I think this is a learning. Let's look at our immigration system first, and how can we facilitate more people to move to Ireland with the full set of rights? Gladly, in the EU, we do have a system close to this, which allows free movement of EU citizens. And the EU gets a lot of stick, I think, often for very good reason, but this is still one of the most remarkable aspects of the Union: free movement for EU citizens and family members, albeit with some limitations. And while I know my former colleague and panelist for the next discussion, Theresa Bukovska, can speak in breadth and depth about the barriers she faced and faces as an EU migrant, there is a notable difference in the experience of EU migrants compared to those non-EU migrants who have whole sets of rights taken from them and have to spend many uncertain years negotiating the immigration system and the citizenship application process before they can even get back to that level playing field in terms of rights. So in short, immigration systems that do the least damage to the prospects of migrant integration are the ones that take as few rights from people as possible and that give back whatever rights they have taken as quickly as possible. What this means more immediately and practically speaking in Ireland, I think, is that we have to look at the categorisation of non-EEA migrants via the stamp system, especially those in categories 1, 2 and 3. We also need to look at the citizenship application process. How can we make it swifter and clearer? The backlog of applications has been mounting, partly due to the pandemic, and this is directly impacting on people's capacity to integrate with Irish society. Not just because it grants the full set of rights, but that it grants certainty for people and families so that they can plan ahead for their lives in Ireland. Now, the measure that the Minister for Justice introduced earlier this year that allows people to complete the naturalisation process by making a statutory declaration rather than attending a citizenship ceremony is to be welcomed, but the very significant backlog and the time people have lost waiting for citizenship has been a lost opportunity to facilitate. I want to talk about the broader issue of inequality as well, and I'm just going to take a short drink of water. There is an underlying assumption, I think, in many debates on integration that there is a coherent, and reasonably equal entity called Irish society that we want newcomers to become a part of. This, of course, is not the case. Taking migration and migrants out of the equation for a minute, we can see huge inequality in Irish society in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of disability, in terms of family status and lone parents, for example. And in my view, there can be no useful debate on migrant integration unless the long-standing issues of inequality in Irish society are also discussed. Otherwise, we will see migrants integrate, but they will integrate into the different strata of inequalities that we already have. And indeed, not only is this very evident already, there is ample evidence across a range of areas that migrants make up a disproportionately large amount of people in disadvantaged groups. For example, if we look at the issue of homelessness, we see a disproportionate amount of non-Irish citizens in the homeless population. And over the last 5 or 6 months, I've accompanied both the Simon Communities and Inner City Helping Homeless on their street outreach, and I've witnessed this fact with my own eyes. And indeed, it was extraordinary in many respects that the whole area of housing and homelessness was absent from the current, now extended, National Migrant Integration Strategy. We simply cannot wait for a new migrant integration strategy to be developed to address this issue in particular. There continues to be cases where migrants are refused social housing supports by local authorities due to misinterpretation of their entitlement to these supports. I want to move on to kind of one of my passions, I suppose, to use an overused word, and that's the area of political participation. And while the current migrant integration strategy has its faults, it is useful in assigning objectives to most other government departments and indeed areas that are not based in government departments. And if I were to pick out one of the areas to focus on, I do think that needs most improvement, but also I think that can deliver most positive change. It is the area of political participation. And going back to that initial template of equal rights, it is an area where Ireland has an advantage compared to other countries, but not one that we have made the most of yet. One of the most enjoyable things that I did on a regular basis as part of my job with the Immigrant Council was workshops with groups of migrants on political participation. And it was a great kick to tell them all that they all not only had the right to vote in local elections, but they all had the right to run in local elections as well. And immediately eyes used to light up when I said that, because people were just not aware of it, and it's a significant right. So just to reiterate that important fact and to make use of this forum today, everyone resident in Ireland, regardless of nationality or type of immigration status, can not only vote in local elections, but also run for local elections. And this is a huge opportunity in my view, and we need to make much more of it. It's a huge opportunity for people of migrant backgrounds, not just to integrate, but to show real leadership in local communities across the country. And I'm thinking there are lots of people listening to this webinar today who are leaders or have potential to be leaders in their communities. And I would really encourage you to consider running for local election as a possibility. I think this area of political participation is particularly important, as while areas of housing, education, immigration system, racism, etc. are all extremely important, what oversees them all and influences them all is the political realm. Now, I think there are a variety of levels where work needs to be done in this regard in terms of political participation. We need to educate and ensure that people know about their electoral rights. That's number one. We need to make it as easy as possible for people to register to vote, and indeed my Green colleague, Mr. Malcolm Noonan, will be overseeing the development of an independent electoral commission, and part of this commission's job will be to educate, to facilitate higher rates of participation and registration, especially in groups that currently participate less in the process. We also need to encourage people to engage with local issues and politics and consider joining political parties. We need to encourage political parties to reach out and actively look for migrant members and encourage and support migrants and people of all types of diversity to run for a local election. And you might rightly ask me then, well, what are you doing about it? And actually, tomorrow week on February 23rd, my own party, the Green Party, will be launching our own local electoral area representative diversity plan, which will launch a push to get more women, people with disabilities, migrants, people from ethnic minorities and different socioeconomic backgrounds to stand as local area reps for the party. And indeed, I encourage all political parties to do the same, as I have done so throughout my career. I've got an image that I would like, that I hope you can see, and I'm not sure who's got control of it, but if someone has control of the image, I'd like to put this image up. It's a picture of, and I don't know if you can see it or not because I have limited view here. It's a picture of 9 people of migrant background who got elected as local councillors in the local elections in 2019. So it's important to say and to show, I think, that there are already trailblazers in this regard. And if we are to have a proportionate amount of councillors elected relative to our migrant population, we would need something like 100 out of the 949. So there is a lot of ground to make up in this regard, especially among the parties, I think. I'm going to go on to the last big issue really that I wanted to talk about this morning. I don't want to let this opportunity pass to mention the scourge of racism. And going back to the theme I was asked to discuss in terms of learning from the past, I think it's fair to say that the state's policy in the past to racism was one of, oh, well, it's not that bad, it's not causing too much problems, let's not be saying too much about it, that kind of approach, the classic Irish kind of brush it under the carpet approach. And I think it's fair to say that policy has failed and was always going to fail. It's almost been 13 years now since we had a national action plan against racism. As a Minister of State, I do think that the state needs to interrogate itself in how it supports racism, and it needs to allow space for others to name state racism and institutional racism when it occurs. There will be a new national anti-racism plan coming soon from my Green colleague, Minister O'Gorman, and I hope it can facilitate the type of constructive self-criticism by the state or indeed by outside actors. There will be legislation to improve the ineffectual Incitement to Hatred Act and online content and legislation that will also help, I think. And I think part of the answer to racism is this strange mix, I think, of empathy and ruthlessness. Now, personally, I've stood up in the Dáil and admitted that I have used racism in my life. And I think if you begin to understand the pervasive nature of it, I'm not sure very many people can claim not to have used it at some stage in their lives, be it in perception or in speech or in actions. And indeed, anyone who has grown up in any country that defines its character in some kind of an us and them paradigm will find it very hard not to have most of its citizens seeing the world through at least a tinted lens of race, I think. I think if we accept the pervasiveness of racism, we can come to the conclusion that a lot of normal and not necessarily bad people use it, often unconsciously. And what I would say in these cases is that we, not just migrants, people of colour or travellers, we all have a responsibility to explain to normal people, for want of a better word, the damage, the hurt, the barriers that racism can cause in a very immediate and practical way. And many of you on this call today will have their own stories to tell in that regard, and I expect we'll hear some of them during the week. So what I'm saying is that I think a lot of Irish people are open to identifying their own racism if they are given the space to do so. So that's the empathetic side of the coin that I wanted to mention. There is also a very different side, though, and here I think we need to be absolutely ruthless. To those who organise hate online, who target people of colour or difference online, who spread lies, hate or misinformation online, you will never win. You are losing and you will always continue to lose. And I say these strong words as I firmly believe every effort at every level must be made to root out organised racism. And it seems to me that social media in particular is problematic in this regard. The distance and often the anonymity that social media allows seems to provide a breeding ground for hate, lies and disinformation, and it needs to be better regulated. Minister McEntee's improvement to hate crime laws will help, I think, in this regard. Also, my Green colleague, Mr. Catherine Martin, has put forward the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill that should improve the situation online. Now, I think new legislation will help root out this kind of behaviour, but I don't think legislation alone can eliminate it 100%. We all in our daily lives need to tirelessly and thoroughly call out and name racism in its virulent and its casual forms. We need to do everything from interrogating how the state itself facilitates racism to supporting grassroots self-organising groups to tackle racism at a local level. And I would like to take this opportunity to say that this is happening effectively at a local level in some communities. And I want to give a nod to Fingal Communities Against Racism in this regard, who I think have shown a very good example on how to tackle racism at a local level. And I think, and Brian and myself didn't coordinate on this, but I'm coming to a similar sentiment to his. And I think it's this inherent goodness and willingness to help others and people new to our communities that can play a key role in successful migrant integration at a community level across Ireland. And it's the willingness, I think, to say hello to a stranger, to hold out the hand of friendship, or to knock on the door to welcome a new neighbour that are also key ingredients in successful migrant integration at a very simple interpersonal level. I'm going to leave it there for now. I hope that's given you some food for thought. And I suppose I want to give a message to people who work in the broad area of migrant integration that I'm very much your ally. I've worked for over 20 years in the NGO sector, in the human rights sector, and it will always be a very big part of who I am and what I do. And I want to wish you all well during the discussions in the week ahead, and to congratulate the Immigrant Council and my colleagues for organising what clearly is a very big and impressive event. Thank you, and enjoy the week.
Thank you very much, Minister O'Brien. We are a little bit beset with technical gremlins. Unfortunately, we couldn't see you during that presentation for some reason. It's the joys of our online world at the moment. But more importantly, we could hear you. So, and we did hear everything that you reflected upon in that, and we really appreciate your input. And I think you showed a couple of different things. First of all, the kind of absolute interconnection between immigration and integration in some regards, that it's very hard to see those things as separate. Your migration rights and the rights that come with crossing that border often inform your integration experience. And as you very rightly reflected upon, you know, migration tends to bring with it a diminution of rights when you cross a border. You come in, but you come in as lesser. And ultimately, does that make any sense? What sense does that make in the long run to do that through an immigration system? And then compounded by layers of bureaucracy and delays and processing times on top of it, which, you know, will come up again and again, I'm sure, throughout the week. But I think as well, you also reflected so well on the opportunities that are there as well, particularly through our open political system that allows for enfranchisement of people from a migrant background, not just as voters, but as candidates. And it is through that enfranchisement that we will begin to see kind of greater reflection, I think, of the diversity that Ireland is, not the diversity Ireland aspires to be or the diversity Ireland might be, the diverse Ireland that exists right now today. So we thank you for your time, and we apologize for the technical difficulties, but as I say, we heard your words, and that's the more important part of it. I know you can't join us for the whole of this morning. We appreciate that. So we wish you luck with your remit and your role, and with everything that's going on at the moment, and everything that is, as you say, you know, within the programme for government that will help in all of these areas. So thank you for your time, Minister. Just a couple of reflections for everybody. In terms of questions, please use the Q&A box that's available in the at the bottom of your screen. We don't have an opportunity to go to people to ask questions, so if you raise your hand, we can question. That's important. Also, for links for the remainder of the conference, the 9 sessions that are on this week, they're all on our website at immigrantcouncil.ie, and you can still register for sessions there. And please do. There's lots going on. Some really fantastic themes and important discussions. One of the things we're most proud of with this seminar this year is that it is us using ourselves as an organization as a platform. So we are using ourselves as a platform for, I think, maybe about 40 different activists and experts and representatives from migrant communities, and representing that diversity that is Ireland, to guide and shape and lead the discussion. So with that being said, I'm going to stop talking right now. One thing I forgot to do, which is a real bad move on my part, is that I forgot to introduce Theresa, who is also a panelist for this morning as well, and I forgot to introduce her bio. So I apologize for that, Theresa, and we'll do so as well. So joining our panel this morning, we also have Theresa Bukovska, who's the Integration Manager with the Immigrant Council of Ireland. She's a Polish migrant woman living in Ireland since 2005, and as I said, is the integration manager here at the Immigrant Council. She holds an MA in ethnography and social anthropology from Poland, and a professional diploma in human rights and equality from the Institute of Public Administration in Dublin. She's also a qualified trainer in diversity management, intercultural competency, and anti-racism, and has published both in Ireland and internationally on racism, integration, best practices, and integration politics. So we're delighted to have Theresa, obviously, as part of the panel this morning as well. So I'm going to moderate this part of the session, and we're going to discuss some of these issues. First of all, what I'd like to do, though, is like our panelists, to give us a little bit of a 5-minute intro to both themselves and some of the key points they bring with themselves this morning from their experience, or even to reflect upon what the Minister said this morning as well, as a good starting point for discussions. So first, I'm going to go to Sarah Duku in Balbriggan. Sarah, if you'd like to go first, and we'll get 5 minutes from you on your own background and your work and some of the key points you're bringing to the discussion this morning. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Brian, and the Immigrant Council of Ireland to having me here today to discuss the future of integration, and especially the integration strategy here in Ireland, and more so in Balbriggan. I am a community development or health advocacy officer in Balbriggan with COJA for the last 10 years in Balbriggan, but I've worked for COJA for the last 20 years now, living in Ireland. COJA is a community development organization. It addresses issues around access and use of health and public services here in Ireland. And our main role is really to advocate for the community in Balbriggan to access these services. And integration is one of the key issues that is addressed along the access of services in Balbriggan. My interest really in attending and being a panel today in this conference is mainly to bring the views of the people at a local level. Integration at a local level is crucial. Without that, we can't have a cohesive community or a cohesive country that celebrates the diversity of people in a state. So integration for us locally is very important. And in Balbriggan in particular, you can hear, and also you've had negative media, sort of stereotypes around integration or level of racism and sort of in Balbriggan. It is to some extent, these portrayals of Balbriggan are true, but for most cases that it has been blackmailed, and as the minister said that the media has played very negative, and the right-wing members of different political parties have played a negative role in publicizing Balbriggan as giving a negative image of Balbriggan. And I would like today to come and share that experience of Balbriggan as a beautiful place to live, but at the same time that it has challenges as well that need to be addressed nationally and locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll pass on to Kira, who is coming to us from Geneva today and with Maastricht University in her background. So Kira, I'd like to pass to you for a 5-minute intro.
Thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, so my name is Kira Murphy. I'm originally from Kilkenny, but I think I'm a little bit of the odd person out on this panel because I'm an Irish immigrant. I have been living in a lot of different countries over the last few years. As Brian said, I'm currently based in Geneva, but I've also been in the Netherlands and Lebanon and in France. So I think that there's a couple of different perspectives that I kind of want to raise at this panel. The first is that when we're learning from our past, it's not just Ireland's past that we have to learn from. It's other countries who have longer migration histories, who have made the mistakes, who have gone through the bad policies and the short-term thinking. And I think for me, that is, so I worked with refugees and asylum seekers in Lebanon, in France, and in the Netherlands. And that is why during my master's, where I studied public policy and I specialized in migration studies, I decided to look at Irish integration policy, because we are such a new immigration country. We had our migration transition into a country of net immigration in the 1990s. So immigration is still a relatively recent phenomenon. And I wanted to look at, so my background was in civil society. I had worked with very local organizations working with refugees and asylum seekers in different countries. And I saw how key it is in integration to have that civil society component, that, you know, civil society are the key to integration. The government cannot force integration, especially social integration. And they also cannot, especially with a mainstreaming policy like Ireland's, you cannot provide access for extremely vulnerable groups without the support of highly specialized support services who understand their needs, their backgrounds, and how to help them to access those services. So for my thesis, for my master thesis, I decided to look at how the Irish integration policy relies on civil society and the assumptions that underlie that, and to actually examine how much those assumptions hold true in reality. So I mapped all of the civil society actors working on integration in Ireland with asylum seekers and refugees, because that was my area of interest, and they're a particularly vulnerable population. And it's particularly interesting because of Ireland's dispersal policy, where they send asylum seekers and refugees across the entire country, which poses particular challenges to civil society organizations. And I also interviewed, I think it was 16 civil society actors across Ireland in the end, to get a perspective of how well this was working and how it could be working better. So that's kind of my main perspective, and maybe we can talk about the findings of the research later. Yeah, so, and I also want to thank the Immigrant Council of Ireland for this event and for giving me the opportunity to share my research here, as well as for participating in the research.
Thank you very much, Kira. That's brilliant. I'll go to Dr. Amanullah Dasandi next. Aman, if you're available to give us your 5-minute intro, thank you.
Hi there. Can you hear me? I assume that's a yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Excellent. A very good morning to you all. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to discuss some of these very important issues. I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference and for inviting me to deliberate on this important topic. I'd like to single out in particular Theresa, who continues to inspire my thinking and approach on these matters. If I have a few minutes now to kind of think a little bit more on these issues. So in my view, Ireland is at a crossroad in societal issues like never before. The pandemic has grounded everyone. It has brought us together in ways that we never imagined. And as you know, the health guidelines of looking after each other really mean something very different now. So it wasn't just acts done by the privileged for the few, but this pandemic has really highlighted issues of racism, Black Lives Matter, homophobia, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, to name a few. Minority issues, you might think, but the minority and the majority have been connected in this pandemic. And for many political leaders, being locked in, being grounded to reflect on these issues is probably a bit of a worry, because it is really connecting us in ways that many of our politicians probably don't want us to. So having a running, and I do mean running quite literally, economy allowed for occasional nods and gestures to the margins, but the mainstream was moving. The fancy word we use for saying that all our social injustices are connected is intersectionality, and that what one marginalized community suffers is connected to all. Integration is, in my view, connected to our resolve. Our goal of understanding these issues that we may not feel affect us, but we are now connected, and this pandemic is teaching us this reality. Integration is a complicated term. Many countries, especially here in Europe, have grappled with this for a long time, and the old world of monoculture does not exist anymore. Take, for example, race. Race is not biological. We know this. We are all the same in that regard, but we do know through our histories and social realities that race has a real impact on our lives. But if there's anything we should be learning from our recent discussions, it is this. Just as we need to accept different identities and ways of living in our society, we all need to feel at home in our spaces, no matter how contested they are. So Ireland's immigration conundrums are vast, but maybe we should be learning from our neighbours on what to do and what not to do. I'm looking forward to discussing my own experience of growing up in Glasgow to Pakistani parents who came to the UK in the 1960s. So it's time for us all. And here is my key question, if there's anything that I want you to take away from this. It is time for us all, including our political leaders, to have a conversation on what makes someone Irish. If we expect integration, we should have the difficult conversation on what makes someone Irish. Is Irishness, as expressed by our leaders, a big tent nationalism? Now, I grew up in Scotland, where I was constantly reminded that we are all Jock Tamson's bairns, a way of saying that it doesn't matter where you are from, but also that there are dangers of exceptionalism in relation to this mantra. So I think one of the key questions is that if we're looking to our minorities and the incoming individuals to talk about integration, it is time for the Irish who tell us that they are Irish to explain exactly what Irishness is. Because once we begin to open that can of worms, we will begin to see the diversity and the pluralism of understanding our Celticity and our connections with other Celtic lands. And I hope to discuss a little more about understanding religious communities. As a Sunni Muslim growing up in Scotland, I was always concerned that Muslims were lumped together. So there's questions of internal diversity that needs to be put in, that we need to be discussing as well. So there's a lot of questions for us today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanullah. And I will hand over to Theresa for her 5-minute intro now before I circle back around and start trying to unpack the many questions and many topics that have been raised in our initial inputs from everybody. So I'll go to you now, Theresa. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. First of all, I would like to give kudos to Minister Joe Bryan, where credit is due credit should be given. It was very fair representation and analysis of the current situation of integration in Ireland. What are the lessons that we should be learning from, and where are the issues that we should be looking forward? But there are a couple of other areas that I would like to add to that. First of all, in Ireland, we don't have a common understanding what integration is. We follow the European Union framework for integration that says integration is a two-way process. Excuse me. But we repeat that statement quite often, but I don't think that we entirely understand what that really means, what that two-way process really is all about. We all talk about providing English lessons to migrants, which is extremely important, but we are forgetting about the richness of languages present in our classrooms and about harvesting this resource to help children learn multi-languages. That's what two-way process of integration is. And once we tackle this problem of lack of national definition and understanding of integration, we can then start planning coherent and comprehensive integration efforts that will have real impact and outcomes for migrants and the whole community and society. I also think that another issue in Ireland with integration is the lack of coordination. Integration cuts across all sectors of Irish lives at national and local level. We can talk about integration with labor market, that's Department of Business and Enterprise. We can talk about integration of health with health sector, that's the health department. Integration with the education system, that's educational department. We have a minister for integration who doesn't hold a remit over those other departments, but what he can do is to coordinate and mediate between those departments to provide best outcomes for integration for both migrants and the community at large. And that's been missing so far, both at national and a local level. We are working with local government on local integration strategies. And we know from the feedback that there is break of communication and coordination from the central government to the local area. Local government is expected to implement local integration strategies, rightly so, because integration happens on a local level, but they don't have clear understanding. Again, what does it mean? What do they supposed to do? What they should be doing in terms of those efforts? And there is not really enough communications on this level. There are also a couple of good examples. I want to mention here Fingal County Council, for example. They've done quite a good job in recent years. They have the integration strategy. They also train staff on issues of diversity and inclusion. And they have a wealth of learnings that could be used and transferred to other local governments because they don't need to reinvent the wheel. They can learn from each other. There is also the Arts Council of Ireland, who has really comprehensive diversity and human rights strategy. And this is also a great example of a leadership in a sector that is not really relating to migration as such, but is taking those issues seriously and is providing leadership. And that is an example that we also should be showing somewhere else. So these are my opening remarks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Theresa. I think on reflection from the four panelists' initial input, I think a common theme is the different levels at which integration happens. So first of all, a person's individual human rights, they're in their family, in their community, at a local level, and then the national level. If I can go back to Sarah, you mentioned on your work in Balbriggan at that level, working in a very diverse community situated in an area which, as Theresa mentioned, in Fingal has a local integration strategy which came online in the last couple of years, and they put a lot of work into that. But then the national level strategy, the Migrant Integration Strategy at national level, expiring this year, going again next year. And one of the observations that we would have from the work we do is clearly that there is a huge difference between integration at a community level and at a national level. There's a huge gulf between those two things, and certain things connect them, like maybe funding streams and things like that. But our approach has been really in Ireland fragmented in that way. Would that be your reflection as somebody working in that community in Balbriggan, that, really did the National Migrant Integration Strategy have any relevance to your daily work? Did it have any impact, either positive or negative?
Thank you, Brian. I actually asked one of the residents in Balbriggan recently, knowing that this conference is underway. I said, I put the question, do you know about the integration strategy? Do you know even the local integration strategy, our Fingal local integration strategy here? And she told me, what are you talking about? Okay, who has the remit actually of making this public to us? Is it in the public domain? Why don't we know about this? This is a clear indication that there is a disconnect. And the disconnect is because, everything is left to the organizations which are meant to inform the communities of the different sort of strategies in place. In my own experience, working in Balbriggan has really the integration strategy, the national integration strategy has any impact? I would say to some extent, yes. It has at least set a platform for a conversation, integration, conversation around migrants, around rights of migrants, around inclusion of migrants in all sectors, all spheres, economic, social, cultural, and religious. However, having said that, has these been implemented? We have indeed the local strategy, which is the Fingal Migrant and Social Cohesion Strategy, which was fantastic. And I really commend the Fingal County Council for setting that up. And that, if I can remember very well, it came out of the mayor's conference on integration and migration in 2015. It was a process that involved everybody. And if migrants and local communities, and it was well received. They indicated a lot of issues that they would want to see addressed. But this is one of the things that came out of the integration forum, integration strategy, that it set a tone. It's so many organizations in Balbriggan now are talking, and within Fingal are talking about it, are trying to make it to include it in their policies, okay, in their working policies, in their recruitment policies and so forth. That integration should be part of it, and that's one of the key things. The other thing is in the local aspect of it as well, is that the establishment of the Fingal Integration Forum, I think this is a direct result of that. The need has arisen. The need has to be implemented, that there is an issue. And if we don't do this now, we will not have a cohesive society. Balbriggan or Fingal will not be a better place for everybody to live in, whether migrants, and we have migrants who have come here to live and make this a better place for them. This is home for them. There is no any other home for many. Like the second generation migrants, they don't know the first home. You know, they think that that home is for mommy and daddy. It is not our home. Our home is Ireland. And I think we need to emphasize that this is the integration strategy is a right direction for the migrants in Ireland, but a lot has to be done. There are a lot of challenges, I know, but there is a lot as well to be accomplished. There are a lot to be addressed. The issues of racism and discrimination is huge. We had a research done recently in Balbriggan by Koja and the Ulster University. The highest number of cases of racism in Balbriggan was unbelievable. People reported that 85% or up to even 95% of participants in that research said that they experienced racism and discrimination. These are the issues. And I think, as the minister earlier on stated, that I think we need to revisit a national plan against racism has to be put in place in Ireland to see that integration really takes place as we want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think you reflect upon a couple of very important things there. One being the importance of setting the tone, the importance of building the framework. So whether it's at a local level through the work of Carja and the Fingal Integration Strategy, or a national strategy. So while we all have, you know, criticisms and we can identify the shortcomings of the national strategy, at least a positive is that it sets a tone for positive engagement. And actually, if you look outside our borders and look even in Europe, that's something important. That's something to be cherished as a good starting point, I think. But I think your identification around as well, the growing up, you know, the second generation, the kids who, for, you know, their parents, the parents are migrants, they're a migrant, I'm not a migrant, I grew up in Balbriggan, you know, that's something that comes through our work an awful lot as well. And actually, just to link with what Amanullah said about growing up in Glasgow when he came there, and I know you wanted to expand upon that a little bit, Amanullah, is there a link there? What, you know, your experience growing up in Glasgow, you know, what can somebody growing up in Balbriggan today learn from that, and what can we all learn from that? What's the difference there? What was good and what was bad? If I can jump to you.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we talk about integration, and we know the separation of integration with assimilation, but I think the integration is sometimes couching that you know, certain individuals and movements want full assimilation. And you know, I'm very tired of the narrative that sometimes is presented that, you know, when anybody comes to Ireland from wherever they've come, that they are expected to throw wherever they have come under the bus, that Ireland saved them, and that wherever their roots are just, you know, and I find this absolutely ridiculous. You know, like I am equally proud of my Pakistani roots, and also growing up in Scotland, I'm very comfortable wearing Pakistani attire just as much as I'm wearing the kilt. But this is the problem that we have. It's about boxing individuals and trying to create neat boxes of identity. But I'm bringing it back again. I'm asking every single Irish person today, what does it mean to be Irish? Because if you're expecting this huge number of people who want to make Ireland their home, and you're saying, okay, we want to integrate, what are we integrating into? What is the difference between somebody who believes and holds strongly to their Irishness in Dublin to somebody who holds strong to their Irishness here in Cork? There is that internal diversity. There is that pluralism. So why is that fuzzy gray area of identity not extended to the migrants that make this country theirs? Why is it that we glorify the diaspora who have never set foot in this country for years? Right? And we know this when we look at the diaspora and the way that we deal with the diaspora, the American diaspora. But we're not willing to ask these very difficult questions of Irishness. This was exactly the same, Brian, that I grew up in Scotland about, you're either with us or you're against us. But there were things that were percolating in Scotland, such as we're all Jock Tamson's bairns, we're all in it together. I'm sorry, but I hope somebody can correct me. I don't hear enough of that here in Ireland. I don't hear enough of that big tent Irishness that will take in all of this diversity. I still think that there are barriers to extending that big tent of Irishness, and that can only be broken down when we begin to understand what Irishness actually is.
Thank you very much, Amanullah. And it reminds me of two things. One, to paraphrase a line from the comedian Tommy Tiernan, who I didn't think would get a mention this morning, but there you go. He had a line before that nobody knows what it means to be Irish, but we all agree it means we're not English. And I think it's a funny line, but it's also quite a telling line in that I think a lot of the historical construction of what it means to be Irish was constructed in the context of being a colony, being under the rule of the English and of the Crown. But that's a very exclusionary and exclusionist view of what Irish identity is. It's a very limited version. You're defining yourself based on an oppositionary kind of a stance to something historical, which obviously still has a resonance today with Northern Ireland. But I think your question as regards how do you define and how do you, put the parameters on what it means to be Irish, that is a conversation that isn't happening. And I wonder, before I go to Ciara, just one quick question for you. How do you go about doing that at a national level? Is it a citizens' assembly? How do we go about defining or addressing that big question about, how do we look at what Irish identity is now for the next 100 years,
I think more conversations like this, more difficult conversations, and more appreciation of the other. You define your identity in relation to others. I defined my Muslimness, my Pakistaniness, my Scottishness as I was growing up in Glasgow, which is steeped in sectarian division between Glasgow Celtic and Glasgow Rangers. It took a long time for me to completely understand who I was. That takes a long time, but it also means that I had very, very difficult conversations with many people in Glasgow. And that is something that I don't think happens. Minorities here, immigrants here are wheeled out as some exotic finery. This is ridiculous. And that is where we need who is controlling the narrative. This is something that Dr. Ibn Joseph brought up yesterday at the end of Douglas Week. Who's controlling the narrative? Who's controlling these stories? So I think difficult conversations are very, very important. But I hope that we don't just aim at deconstructing something and leaving it as a mess, that we all unite in this idea that we want to build Ireland. We want to build this for something good. And that means being uncomfortable.
We haven't set enough time for this session at all. We could go on all day, but I think there is one really important point there as well when you talk about who is setting the narrative, and also who are those in positions where the narrative is being set, are they reflective of what Irish society looks like? Is the media reflective? Is politics reflective? Are they actually inclusive? Because if you can't do that, if that's not the case, then how can that be an inclusive conversation, But I'm conscious of Ciara as well, because obviously your work here has looked at Ireland and looked at the importance of civil society. And we touched upon it earlier, where that stratification almost of, local community, with civil society built around them at local and national level, local strategies like the likes of the Fingal Integration Strategy and the national strategy. there's a disconnect at all of those levels. And I think your work here kind of looked at that in detail. What are your reflections on that, I suppose, from having looked at it in that detail?
Just maybe one thing before I get to that question. I think Aminullah's point and your point about Irishness as victimization is such an important point. And I think that if we want to really address the question, we have to look at our education system. We have to look at how we're teaching history, because the oppression of Ireland is so important, but we really need to look at, you know, how can we broaden that and broaden our understanding of Irishness. So on the strategies, I think one thing that Ireland has done quite badly with the integration strategies is the incorporation of the local level in an actual meaningful way, not just in a doing lip service of local communities are key and local authorities are key. The strategy is still highly centralized, and local authorities are given very little power and very little funding to actually address the local issues. And you really see this reflected in the funding that is then provided to civil society. And this is something that shocked me, to be completely honest, because I had worked in France and I had worked in the Netherlands. Lebanon is a totally different situation, but there you have a very consistent funding stream for organizations that are working with refugees and asylum seekers, for example. And I know that refugees and asylum seekers is a different context than the rest of the migrant integration strategy. Another thing is that asylum seekers are not even incorporated into the migrant integration strategy, and refugees are not considered as a separate entity, even though their context and their situation is so different than the other migrants, especially because it's so hard to immigrate into Ireland. So we get you have serious class differences, education differences. It's not representative. And so firstly, we don't even incorporate these populations. And secondly, we really leave behind the local level. And I think it's so interesting because the Immigrant Council of Ireland is the one who's trying to make this connection with local integration strategies. This is not coming from the government, it's coming from civil society, where the Immigrant Council of Ireland is providing the expertise to help local authorities to actually create a migrant integration strategy for their local areas. And I think that's such important work, and it's so important because integration does not happen at the national level. There are these really big questions like changing laws and access to citizenship and family reunification, because we do citizenship relatively well, but we do family reunification, some of the worst in Europe, if not the world. Our family reunification policies are a disgrace, especially since the 2015 change to the law. So those things happen on a national level. And civil society is also really important because they hold governments accountable. They are the ones saying, actually, this is not working because we're working with the people who are trying to make use of these policies. But it's the local level where people actually begin to feel at home. And that's why we're talking about Finglas. It's why we're talking about Balbriggan. It's why if you talk about like local resettlement policies, you talk about the Rohingya in Carlow. You know, you don't talk about the Rohingya in Ireland. They don't feel like they're, you know, sure they feel like they're a part of Ireland, but it's Carlow that's their home. And this is something the government is not providing enough power to local authorities to actually take care of what they need to, and enough funding. Because, for example, I worked in Maastricht, and the organization that I worked with was funded, and that includes staff funding, which is really key because integration cannot happen through project funding. It happens through people. And the government makes a community integration fund of 5,000 euros for 1 year with no staff funding for only new projects. And they act as if this is sufficient. It's 500,000 euros. I mean, this is not how integration works. It doesn't happen with project costs in 1 year. It happens with consistent support to civil society where it is needed. And the where it is needed, I think, is really key because we have this dispersal policy. And at no point in the dispersal is access to services, even basic services like a GP, which a lot of these towns are already struggling with, considered in whether or not they should put a housing center there. And for sure, they do not consider whether or not there are local civil society there actually available with the capacity and the resources to help those people to integrate and to access services. We acknowledge in our strategy that civil society is super important, and then there's basically nothing done to actually support them. So my recommendations in my research was, you have two choices. You either send refugees and asylum seekers to places where you know there is already civil society there with the capacity and the resources, or you send them to places that don't have them and you make sure that they are created. You make sure that there are resources, that there is funding, there is expertise to set up a local civil society organization. I call my research Integration Postcode Lottery because that is essentially what we are doing. We are creating a postcode lottery where your access to asylum, to legal status in the first place, and your access to integration services entirely depends on where you end up getting sent in the country. And that is an unsustainable and dysfunctional integration strategy. And other countries in Europe have learned that it does not work. You need to start at the beginning and have a plan of how these people are going to be integrated.
Thank you very much, Kira. So much in what you've just touched upon, and so much that we would, I suppose, absolutely share in terms of our reflections as a civil society organization, working at that kind of in-between stage. You know, we're facing the government at one stage, trying to drag them this way, facing local communities and trying to drag them this way, and getting everybody in the room, which is often what we find ourselves doing. And I think one of the things that I suppose is very strongly reflected in what you say, and it's something that we've touched upon as an organization many times, is kind of the reactive nature. So we're not planning 10, 15, 20 years ahead. What's migration in Ireland going to look like in 20 years time? That's a question, you know, you're almost, you know, forbidden from asking. It's very reactive. It's like, we have people coming now, we need a bed for them tomorrow, what are we going to do tomorrow? You know, so it's very much that kind of lack of planning on the back foot, lack of investment, and lack of long-term kind of structural vision, essentially, you know. As I say, this is a space we occupy a lot as an organization, and Theresa manages our integration work, which is many strands, trying to pull together different parts of work. So Theresa, your reflections on that, because as you know, you work directly with leaders from a migrant background, building capacity, doing that individual thing. You work with groups, but you also work with local authorities. You work at the national level as well. How does that go?
Oh, there is so much to unpack from what everyone said so far, but I guess what I wanted to focus, perhaps that hasn't been discussed yet, is about migrant leadership and capacity building. And not so much about capacity building, rather harvesting the capacity that already exists in there. Migrants don't really have that much of influence and engagement in building Irish integration policies, and as well civil societies. And we have to be fair in here. Irish civil society, the migration sector, is led by non-migrants, and that's not right. That has to change. We need to provide platform for migrants because we have plenty of experts in the field. Look at the lineup of this conference. Most of the speakers are migrants, but they were chosen and invited to speak at this conference because they are experts in their respected fields. Migration or refugee identity is secondary, right? So we need something similar at the national and local level, but we need resources for that, because the national and local government organizes a lot of these consultation forums, integration forums, advisory committees, but they do not provide funding for that, and that costs time. I am funded by Immigrant Council, so I can attend those meetings, right? But there is so many other people with such an insightful knowledge and expertise that can add important information to building those policies that cannot attend because they have to go to their work. So when we are building consultation bodies, and I know that the Green Party in the election manifesto had proposal for a national consultative body of migrants, we need to provide resources. Because it's not only about integrating migrants into the Irish society, as I've mentioned before, it's a two-way process. It's about harvesting the capacity and the strength and expertise that we are bringing with us when we're coming to this country, that we can make decisions about our lives in future. So it's not only about providing resources to the civil societies who are filling in the gaps, which is extremely important. And I need to mention here Irish civil societies, because international civil societies are great, but they do not have expertise on a local level, and they do not have links with local networks. But we also need to invest in migrant leaders. Minister O'Brien said a lot about political participation, and that is extremely important part of our work. And we're working with migrant candidates, potential candidates for local elections. We provide training on voting rights and so on. But there is so many other areas where migrant leaders can bring so much benefits. And we need to provide platforms and resources for that, both local and national level. We need diversity in civil societies. The last integration strategy had rather unambitious target of 1% of civil society, civil servants being of a migrant background. We didn't even reach that in the last 4 years. That is really unacceptable. 12%, 1 in 8 of Irish society are migrants, and we need that reflection in our decision-making structures and amongst our leaders. And I would say that this is something that we still have to catch up. And once we, and that can make a huge difference.
Thank you very much, Theresa. I'm struck by this morning's session is really good in that it's identifying many of the themes that are coming throughout the week. So, for example, when we touch upon the issue of racism, we touch upon the issue of leadership and capacity building. These are themes throughout the week. So I'd encourage anybody who's watching this morning to look at our website and look at the other 8 sessions that will follow this, where we go into these issues in a bit more detail with different panels, and some of our panelists from today will be involved in those sessions as well. So if you feel we're just touching upon things and scratching the surface, that is true, and it's also apt, I suppose, in terms of setting the scene for the discussions that we have this week. We're coming towards where we said we would start getting some questions, and I encourage everybody to use the question and answer box there, and I notice some questions being answered in text as well as those that I will put to the panel in a few minutes. But I suppose in terms of one of the things that we often reflect upon, I think, is that in Ireland we have the component parts. When we talk about the expertise that Theresa just talked about, the experience, the advocates, the voices that are there, when we talk about the local community actions that Sarah talked about in terms of the community in Balbriggan, when we look at, as Kira identified, the different components that make the structural application of integration actually a thing, whether it's civil society or strategic plans or the kind of structural issues we need around it. And when Amanullah talked about the broader questions around identity, we do have the capacity, I believe, to address these issues. So something that we want to try and pull out from this week as well is good practice, good ideas, positive initiatives, what's happening either at a national or a local level or even internationally that we can draw from in Ireland. So that's the next question I'm going to pose to our panelists, really. And maybe I'll start with you, Sarah, in Balbriggan. I've known you for 20 years. I began as a volunteer working with you 20 years ago. So it's been fantastic to see your career and your experience over that last 20 years as well. And you are in one of the most, kind of intercultural / multicultural towns in Ireland. What kind of good stuff do you see come out of that? Or like, what are the positives that are the positive initiatives that are happening at that community level that you think are having real impact?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, we go a long way together. I still remember the days that you walked in for an interview, volunteer position in Koja in Dublin. It was great having you, and you were really a loss as well for the organization at the time. Yes, there is a lot of initiatives need to be to take place in Balbriggan to see sort of a positive integration in Balbriggan. A number of initiatives that were initiated by civil society organizations like ourselves. The Integration Forum in Balbriggan was one of the key initiatives that came up in Balbriggan, and it set a stage for us to talk about integration in Balbriggan. And that came, if I could set the stage for it, when 10 years ago, when I walked into Balbriggan and I started going there as an outreach worker in Balbriggan. At the time, there were the Vicentians that were running Folcha Balbriggan, supporting refugees and migrants in Balbriggan. And because of the proximity of Mosney and Balbriggan, there were lots of migrants who were given status, or asylum seekers who were given status to come to, and the easiest or the nearest area for them to reside was, or to settle, was Balbriggan. So when I started going to Balbriggan, there was absolutely nothing in Balbriggan for migrants, no services at all. When we walked there, we felt the need, through talking to the community in Balbriggan, that there was a need for integration. We had two groups of communities, the migrant and the host community, and there was no interaction whatsoever. So the integration, the conversation started then, and the need arose from both the host community and the migrant community, that they needed the space. They needed to start talking about integration. They needed to address their common experiences that they have. And I think this is where we go to where we look at the approach in Ireland, that the interculturalism or approach in integration, whereby bringing the two communities to look at what common needs do they have to address to make Balbriggan a better place, instead of looking only addressing the issues of migrants. So the Integration Forum was a brilliant initiative, and until to date, we have had good things come out of the Integration Forum in Balbriggan. We have had small organizations rise up, civil society or community organization, grassroots organization rise up out of the Integration Forum. We have the Taste of Nations, which is a big part of the Summer Fest in Balbriggan, and it's well received in Balbriggan, and what we don't want to see is that we don't want to see integration being seen as food, and provision of food or sharing of food. This is part of it, but there is more to that. Okay, we've seen Empower coming in, taking over from Fingal Partners, becoming the leader, the leader organization in Balbriggan, whereby they have incorporated integration into, and I think it is a mandate of SICAP, as you mentioned earlier, to make sure that immigrants are informed, educated about the labor market. And we've seen that such initiatives have brought integration actually more prominent and setting the stone in Balbriggan. One thing I wanted to say, and which Kira earlier on mentioned, was around the issue of funding. Has the integration funding actually made an impact in Balbriggan with regards to integration? Absolutely zero. And I would say this categorically, that absolutely zero. What would €1,000 do to a community, a very culturally diverse, which is hungry for integration? Okay, this would maybe fund only one program, maybe a football match. Okay, and that is it. There is no sustainability with that kind of sort of funding. Integration is about, it is a process. It is not a one-stop initiative. It is a process. And we need that the department, the OPMI should look into this, that the 500,000, the 500,000 across Ireland is nothing. This is a token. It is actually, to be honest with you, it is an insult for the integration strategy here in Ireland. We need to fund workers. Integration Forum in Balbriggan has been in existence since 2013, when it was established. We don't have, it is reliant on volunteers who can offer their 2 hours a week. We need them to fund workers, need to fund employment within the Integration Forum, so that at least there is a sustainability, that the worker will be able to organize organize activities, integration activities that are badly needed in a community like Balbriggan, where it is really culturally diverse. We have, Balbriggan is, we have nearly the average age in Balbriggan is about 30 years of age. And when we look at the average age between 0 to 14, there is a big, huge population of nearly 48% or thereabout of young people in Balbriggan. How many youth organizations do we have in Balbriggan? We are talking about, these are the future. If we cannot sort of get the youth to be integrated in a community, their own community, how will the future be? There is only one organization that addresses issues of the youth in Balbriggan. And in that organization, we have only one full-time employee. To be honest with you, there is a lot to be done. A lot of initiatives need to be created. And all this is reliant on funding. Funding needs to be stepped up. The integration, I mean, the Department of Justice through the OPMI needs to look at funding not only projects, but funding long-term projects with employees to run, to make sure that integration is grounded so that we can have a better community or a better society in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, absolutely. I think continually we're struck by the fact that so much at a local level relies upon volunteerism and relies upon individual initiative. Like you said, all those years ago, somebody identifying there's a gap here, there's nobody doing anything here, we have to start doing something, and beginning to eke out some kind of support at a local level that may turn into an organization, it may turn into a volunteer group. But how do you keep that capacity? How do you keep those people engaged? How do you keep that expertise that they build up over 20 years in the sector? You know, how do we build upon things rather than kind of treading water, I suppose, which is the feeling that I think a lot of people have working at a local level, that they can't sustain working at a local level because, well, I have a family to feed. If I get a different job that's going to pay me better, I'm just going to, I'm going to go, and their expertise and their experience is lost, So again, it's that planning thing, isn't it? It's that 10, 15 years, 20, 20 years ahead, planning to structurally build our capacity to do integration in Ireland, not just react to it and tread water, and that kind of leads a little bit into Ciara as well, your work, that building of that structural capacity. Internationally, you spoke about the Netherlands, and you spoke about, sorry, I can't remember where else it was, you said that you have experience, but that there is that more recognition. And how does that happen? Is that a political choice? It's not just a budget. It's not just who has the funding, the purse strings of the budget. Is that a political choice? Is that public pressure? What was the background to it happening in other countries?
I think that is a very important question, because the background is that they totally failed. When they first got large migrant populations, and this was it's also very historically specific because these are temporary migrant workers, which I think is a lot of how we treat also our migrant populations, especially our EU migrants, who we see primarily as workers, and also because we require kind of work permits. And then the population stayed, and they had been intentionally excluded from the population. There was no integration because they were all supposed to go home, but they were doing jobs that did not end in 1 year or 2 years. They were doing long-term jobs, so of course they stayed. And then they ended up with ethnic ghettos, with violent extremism, with all of these issues, and they realized that it didn't make any sense, that they had basically kind of cut off their nose to spite their face in originally excluding these people and not having an integration strategy. So it was really a lesson that they learned the hard way. And it was why I wanted to do this work, because Ireland doesn't need to learn this lesson the hard way. Other countries have made the mistakes for us. We can learn from them instead of having to do it ourselves. So yes, and there is a very real political acknowledgement, and sometimes it's even toxic because migrants are seen as a threat sometimes because of violent extremism and which has been a problem in a lot of countries, especially France. Yes, so I think that is a really important point, and really you now see, especially in the Netherlands, an increasing acknowledgement that it's the local level that integration happens. So even now, the Dutch are bringing in a law to localize even more the integration, to give local authorities more power, more funding, more authority over how they deal with their local integration. And I think it's also an acknowledgement that the Netherlands, like Ireland, is not a single society. They have different languages that they speak in the south. And you cannot expect someone, you know, it cannot be at a national level that happens. Kerry is a totally different place from Monaghan, and you know their cultures are very different. And if you want people, so yeah, I think this is a really it's a really key lesson to learn, and it's exactly that. Yeah, I mean, funding is the key issue, and this is something that I learned from my research, that I talked to people who were giving up 15 hours, 20 hours of their weeks to do work that the government should have been doing. To really, and it's a total abdication of responsibility on the part of the government to just allow, and Minister spoke about how important volunteers are so important. There's no question. When it comes to integration, when it comes to social integration, volunteers are so key, but they cannot be volunteers who are full-time working on this. In Kilkenny, the only specific immigrant support services that we have are run by volunteers. And the volunteer that we have, who has given up years of her life to do this, is in her 70s, and it is totally unsustainable because once she finishes, there's nothing to replace her. Immigrants have no support left in Ireland, in Kilkenny. On the lessons learned, there's one thing that I would really like to say, and it's a policy issue, and I come from a policy background, so policy is kind of what I'm interested in. And when it comes to asylum seekers, the randomized dispersal, all of the research says that it does not work. We have this assumption when we disperse asylum seekers and refugees across the country, and even when we talk about integration, that migrants having social connections with other migrants is a negative thing. All of the research says that that is a positive thing and needs to be encouraged. So if we want to split up Syrians and send them across the country and send them with people from all different backgrounds, their integration prospects are worse. We need to start having a clustered dispersal policy where we keep communities together so that they can have that initial strong social bonds. And you see a really successful program with the Rohingya in Carlo, who feel really like they're part of Carlo because there's 100 of them placed there together. And you have to be very careful about managing it. But I think that this is a really interesting point and a really important lesson learned from other contexts, that prioritizing social bonds between migrants and people from their own backgrounds actually helps integration.
Thank you very much. And I think, you know, reflecting on it as an Irish person who emigrated myself in the past and worked in the US, Irish communities in the US are like that, you know. If you go into, you know, San Francisco, where I was at different times as well, the network that was available there for work, for jobs, for this, for that, for the other, was a huge bonus. And it wasn't viewed as a negative thing. It wasn't viewed as a kind of a, well, they're just keeping to themselves, the Irish, you know. It was actually a support structure, and it didn't mean that they weren't integrated. It just meant that they had a support structure. So I think, you know, you would think Irish people should reflect a bit more on that. We know that, we've done that, we've been abroad, you know. So thank you very much for that. And I think just one of the other things to reflect upon from what you said as well, in other countries, they came to this conclusion when things were already on fire. You know, when they came to this conclusion when they had failed. They had gone down this road for so many generations. Just look at France and look at the multi-generational disenfranchisement in France. So they eventually came around to this. And we have an opportunity in Ireland not to do that. We have an opportunity not to go down that road, down that dead end. And that's why, you know, I think it was Sarah used the expression earlier on, a crossroads, that we're at a crossroads. Maybe it was a man. And we are at that crossroads. We have that opportunity. Sorry, I'm making a speech here, which I didn't mean to do, but anyway. But I think as well then, the political choice is also important. It's also important then that our political representation is diverse and reflects consciousness of that, reflects kind of a visibility of that. Because if your political structures don't bear that into their thinking, how can you expect that to be reflected in political decisions as well, you know? So all these things are connected, which makes it very complicated. Manolo, I'd like to go to yourself as well now, because obviously, as I say, we're touching upon so many different things this morning, which is apt. But maybe to come back around to my question of, you know, as you said, in the last 12 months in particular, maybe, although it's been going on for a very long time, but especially in the last 12 months, the visibility of these conversations has jumped massively. And as you rightly identified, in the absence of an official way to harness these conversations or to facilitate these conversations, they're just happening themselves. And that's a good thing. But it's also, how do we build upon that? So like, you know, as you say, the last 12 months in Ireland, and even just looking at the program for our conference for the week, the visibility of the level of expertise, the activists, those that are out there, how do we harness that, and how do we get it to a new level? How do we make sure that we're not just treading water, we're actually building something on this?
I think, you know, one point that we should really reflect upon and be thinking about is the resilience of individuals who get up every single day and take part in countering issues that will build bridges. That takes a huge toll. You know, I've spent, this isn't my academic expertise. When I got my PhD in 2009, I thought I was falling into a lovely little university bubble where I could just sit and write about, you know, these wonderful texts. But I very quickly understood that there were structural issues within universities. So if we're talking about global and national, I understood that my local, the place that gives me a sanctuary, the university, is very white. And when I moved to Ireland, when I moved to Cork in 2015, I got here and I was very excited because I came from Miami after 5 years in Miami, and I thought, oh, Cork has so much in common with Glasgow. But I also very quickly realized that Cork is very white. And looking at my local, then the university is very white. The diversity that we see in our students is not reflected within our universities. So if we're talking about integration issues, Irish universities need to take this on board and really begin to think carefully. And I know there are other sectors, there are schools and other educational institutions, but I'm talking about what I know, that the universities have a lot to answer for in trying to make this better. So how do we do that? I mean, you look at equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's sometimes, thrown out like it's a very nice, sexy thing to say. But I'm looking, and I think many Black, Asian, minority, ethnic individuals at universities are looking for real structural changes at universities. We are making good progress when it comes to the issues of promotion and women. But like we said, all our social inequalities are connected, which means bringing into the conversation about Black, Asian, minority, ethnic individuals. I fought very hard to get to where I am. I mean, one day I will write about all the racism and the microaggressions that I had to deal with, and people say to me, oh gosh, man, you've got such great privilege. You've got a permanent job, you're a senior lecturer, you're a head of department. Nobody understands how many, sleepless nights and reacting to, threats on a phone from individuals who say, oh gosh, how is this individual going to lead a religion department when he's Muslim, right? I've had to deal with all of that. So individuals who fight and individuals who are trying to build bridges, we should think about how exhausting it is. Just as Ian Wright, the footballer, who's I think close to 60 years old, turned around and told us he is tired. Somebody who has millions of followers. So to ask, and this is why I think one of the most important thing is I want everybody to be involved in this. It's not up to migrants. It's not up to migrants to solve the problem of the way in which we're not being told what Irishness is. We need an answer to this, and we need to be part of that conversation, because Irishness cannot be concluded or defined based on the immigrants that come here. Surely there's something more to it than that. That is what we need. And when we do that, I think we will move forward. But on a more structural level, University College Cork is making huge progress. We have the first time we have a race equality forum, which I am co-chairing with Margarita from the Traveller community. Again, all our social injustices are connected. I'm leading a monthly conversation on racism in Ireland. I ask difficult questions and one of the other things that I wanted to do was I wanted to have conversations with Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, so that we have it between ourselves. Part of the problem is that we have too many white saviors who want to save us. that needs to be challenged, and that needs to change as well. But that means, as Sarah's saying, it means structural changes and allowing individuals to get into those power structures. And again, it's, you know, unconscious bias and all of these issues are plaguing us in order to do that. But we're not giving up. This is what I say to my students. This is what I say to individuals who come to me and say, how am I going to survive in Islamic studies? How am I going to survive in this white, you know? I said, you fight. And you raise the questions and you continually do that.
Thank you. And something that triggers though as well, like in terms of the constant need to have to fight, the mental health impact of all of that in the background as well, the constantly being on that, you know, kind of front line and getting that negative reaction. And that's a whole other, we need a whole other week of conferences to deal with the mental health impacts of that constant attrition. You know, that's extremely difficult to, I would imagine, extremely difficult to have to face on a daily basis, you know. One of the things I want to come to Theresa before I circle back around with a couple of questions that have come in from those that are viewing the webinar. But one of the things we talked about there is that defining conversation about what it means to be Irish. And it strikes me that the arts is quite a place that happens as well. And Theresa, you have wear the dual hat of also being on the board of the National Arts Council as well. That's a conversation I'm sure you've had in that context, and not to put you on the spot as regards that, but do you have reflections from that of how the arts can actually help us define that big, messy, tangled cultural question of what it means to be Irish?
I guess what I want to start is with a couple of stuff, because there is so much important points that we pick up through this conversation, and I really don't want to leave without again reiterate on the issue of mental well-being, because people standing up every day to fight, they relieve trauma every day. And sometimes we have to do that because there is no other choice, because there's nobody else who will do that for us. Sometimes we need a little bit of a break here. And again, the toll on mental health is exhausting. When it comes to what Irish identity, I'm doing a lot of workshops on diversity, inclusion, anti-racism. And one of the exercises that I do is I divide the group. Mostly participants are all white Irish people. I divide the group into smaller groups of 3-4 people, and I ask them to define what does it mean to be Irish. The arguments, the conversations, the discussions that people have between them because they cannot agree between themselves. What does it mean to be Irish? So if they cannot agree between themselves, what does it mean to be Irish? How they can expect other people to subscribe to one particular identity that it's undefined? If love to this country and to this land, if love to these people living here, a commitment to the well-being of people, commitment to progression and equality of people living in Ireland is to be Irish, then I am no less Irish than anyone else in here. And I think that's quite important. It's about who we are and what role we are playing in this society, rather our genetic background, because identity is about connection, sense of belonging, and love. And I think that's what we are all sharing here. When it comes to arts, as I mentioned, the Arts Council of Ireland, even before I joined them, they took on quite important leadership role. They design diversity and human rights and equality and inclusion strategy, and they tied it to funding. So now anyone applying for funding has to make a commitment to that policy and that strategy, and has to make important steps and show that they are making important steps into implementing this policy within the work that they're doing. But arts is very much connected to culture, and culture is connected to the idea of identity and belonging. And we also should be having this conversation and expanding the notion, what does it mean to be Irish, using arts, because arts is international language, language that doesn't have to be verbalized, and we can connect through arts, and we can show each other the connections that we have. But we also need to be careful here not to marginalize certain forms of arts, because it's kind of idea that, if you are coming, like, if you are a Polish artist, this is an ethnic art, right? This is not an ethnic art. This is just art, period. If you are coming from Zimbabwe, this is an ethnic art. This is not an ethnic art. This is art, period. We have to understand that there are different forms of art and they are of equal value. But people coming to Ireland and bringing those forms of arts, they are merging them with Irish arts as well and creating new, interesting, vibrant forms. And let's look at those interesting, vibrant forms. They are really great to be experiencing. And that's exactly what identity is. You can have this vibrant and active identity where you are both Polish and Irish, you are both Pakistani and Irish and Scottish, you are both Irish and Brazilian. And I think that's quite important for us to understand that there is no one idea of identity, and let's look at arts, because that's where we can learn a lot from.
Thank you, Theresa. I'm conscious that we're coming up against our 12 o'clock finishing time, and I'm conscious of the 2 hours that our panelists have given us this morning, and I'm extremely appreciative of it. There's a couple of questions that have come in through the question and answer box that I'd like to address, or I'd like to put out for the panelists to respond to. One for Ciara, in terms of the EU level guidance on integration, and maybe you may be the best placed person to answer this in terms of your studies. What can Ireland learn from that EU level for example, the Integration and Inclusion Action Plan 2021 to 2027, it can seem very far away from somebody working like Sarah in a community in Balbriggan, but are there things in that that are pertinent that can be drawn from that? Like, we obviously have to learn from what's happened around us as a country, and one way to do that is take some of that knowledge, that distilled knowledge from the European Commission as well. So are there good things in that?
This is funny because I'm not actually familiar with this. My research ended in 2020, and now I work in preventing violent extremism. So all of my research is now focused on preventing violent extremism. One thing I will say, I think it's really important that strategy goes from 2021 to 2027. And I think that in itself is a lesson that Ireland needs to learn. Integration is a long-term thing. It's a long-term conversation. It involves helping Irish people to accept other nationalities as much as it involves helping migrants to learn English or to get legal rights, or etc. And these things take a long time, and we need to start having longer term strategies. But unfortunately, I can't help you with the context.
Thank you, Ciara. Apologies for putting you so on the spot with that question. But I think actually, with a bit of familiarity with it ourselves, there is, I think, as I said, maybe in the introduction part there to the question, there is a lot, I think, and it harkens back to what Sarah said earlier about what happens in Fingal communities at a local level, about setting the tone, and it's that still kind of the opportunity, I suppose, to know that mistakes have been made about the barriers and to draw upon them, and I think steady the hand of politicians here in Ireland as well, to say, listen, look around us, these mistakes have been made, and those kind of principles. So thank you to the person who posed that question, and again, apologies, Ciara, for putting you on the spot as regards answering it. But I suppose the other question I'd like to ask is maybe to Sarah. There is a question in the box as regards the difference between integration and inclusion. So like, this comes up every now and then. You'll hear like a local authority that, for example, used to have an integration office, subsumed it into the social inclusion office within that local authority. And in some ways that makes sense, that the switch from calling something inclusion rather than calling it integration. Maybe it's an academic argument because it's about terminology, but I think in the impact of that, we saw, for example, that it not being a standalone issue within that local authority actually took from their overall focus on it. Do you have any reflections on the terminology around integration and inclusion? Pulling it out as something that is standalone versus something that is included in the fabric of what happens at a local level?
I think it would be fair to say that inclusion, if I could put it rightly so, is that it is a determinant of integration. Okay, if you don't feel accepted, if you are not you don't feel included, there is no way that you will, you know, have or feel that you are integrated into the society. So I think they go hand in hand. You wouldn't separate them, but they need to go hand in hand. Okay. And for example, you know, let's take the labor market, for example. You know, if you apply for a job in the labor market, and or maybe it's not the best example there, like in the community, say in Balbriggan, okay, there are different groups, different individuals, different nationalities. You walk into something, you feel automatically that, oh, am I really? Do I feel the sense of place? Am I deliberately, are they deliberately excluding from this space? Okay, so therefore, will I feel integrated in a society or in the community if this is lacking? I just want to bring it really very simple. So I think that these two have to go hand in hand, and you can't separate the two. And it's important that even integration policies has to include the element of social inclusion, because they are two different but important areas that have to go hand in hand. I don't know whether I answered you there. I think I'm,
yeah, no,
you know.
Absolutely. And I loved your line at the start where you said that inclusion is a determinant of integration. Am I right in quoting you saying that? That's the way you described it?
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it. I love that. Thank you for that. Coming up against time, we have 3 minutes left, but I would like to go back to Amanal one more time before we wrap up. And actually it fits in what the example Sarah has just given in relation to a classroom. You know, the modern Irish classroom, whether it's at primary school level, secondary school level, third level, is an incredibly diverse place, way more diverse than when I was in school in the 80s and 90s. We had no diversity whatsoever back then. So it's a very, very different place. Again, education, and it's not a particular theme we've pulled out necessarily of this series of seminars we have this week, because in and of itself it's huge. But the context of education and the context of young people growing up in Ireland is a huge part of how we might achieve things like integration and inclusion. We talked earlier about the question of what it means to be Irish, but also I think that conversation, and it comes from one of the questions in the box about, you know, people coming from different backgrounds and different nationalities, what it means to be, you know, a Pakistani person who's grown up in Scotland, or a Scottish person of Pakistani background, what it means to be someone who is Rwandan that grew up in Ireland, what it means to be somebody who is of any, you know, Polish and grew up in Ireland as well. That conversation between the different backgrounds and what we can learn from that. You know, how important is the educational space to do that, and how do you build that again? How do you build upon those kind of that richness that's there now? There's a huge wealth of knowledge and a huge wealth of experience there that we can draw upon as a country.
I think you're absolutely right, Brian. But you know, let's not forget that our universities are led by the English language, and that in itself is a huge issue. You know, you can, you know, I have many you know, prospective students who I can have a conversation with in a different language, but they might not be able to put that together in English, and that's a huge limiting factor. So, you know, our systems are set up in ways that can be limiting. And I don't have an answer to that. I still, you know, I walk into a room and people can make all sorts of assumptions, but when I open my mouth with my Scottish accent and being able to speak like this, it breaks down so many stereotypes that, you know, I've actually had people who have stopped me and said, what did you think about my point that I just made? And they were like, oh gosh, with that accent, you could say whatever you want, it doesn't matter. Now that's a point for reflection. Now we might laugh at this, but it also means that somebody who doesn't have the fluency of language, what's happening to them? What kind of perception are we going away with about them? And that I find that's really disheartening. But I know but I continually work to try to find some positivity in that and how we do that, because I still think that education is so important. My father had very high school education. My mother is completely illiterate. She looks at her envelopes that arrive through her post box in Glasgow, and she looks at the images that are on the envelopes. And here I am as a head of department here in Cork. I think about my privilege that I have in that, but I also think about your average individual who doesn't have the fluency of the English language, who can't sit and write to the Irish Times editor and say, I have this wonderful thought, I have this great privilege of sitting to write about this great poet here in Ireland. We don't have the privilege of that. We're barely making it. So there are structural changes that need to happen in order to lift up individuals so that we have that equality, we have that inclusion. And that's going to take years. I mean, you think about the generations in the UK, about integration, about my generation, my father's generation that came in the 60s. These are issues that are going to be with us for a very, very long time, for kids, in the next generation who are going to have that fluency of Irish here in Ireland. But it also means that this integration is also always going to be fragile. It's like democracy is always fragile. We're going to constantly need to question and to appreciate the other. And that's going to need a lot of hard work, and it's going to need a lot of difficult questions. But, if there's anything you can take away, I hope we can do it through humor. I hope we can do it through having a wee bit of a laugh. And I hope we can do it by getting together with some positivity. Because I know I've asked a lot of difficult questions, and, a lot of people say to me, oh gosh, man, I totally agree with what you're saying. But I also understand that there has to be a moment of, humor and to draw closer to one another, and to lift each other, and that requires us to do a lot more. So I hope we can do that, and I think we are going on a good trajectory here in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aman, and thank you very much for the positive note. I'm conscious of time, and I'm a notoriously terrible moderator in that I have a difficulty ending conversations that I think are fascinating. So thank you all for your time this morning, for your input. As I said, we touched upon so many different areas, but that's really apt because the National Migrant Integration Strategy looks at so many different areas. Local integration strategy look at so many different areas and where they intersect, and where the lack of one thing undercuts the development of another thing. But they are also themes that we are hoping to explore throughout the week, and I encourage everybody watching us to have a look at the list of seminars and workshops and panels like this throughout the week. Based on this fantastic kickoff, I think it'll be a really, really, fantastic week, and so much to be learned. I've learned so much this morning from this conversation. The work of the Immigrant Council continues in a lot of these areas, as I know does the work of so many different people out there in organizations and individually, and as we mentioned earlier, some on a volunteer basis as well. So I think, as we always say, we have the component parts, and as an organization, we always commit to trying to do what we can to try and bring some of those component parts together, and then play our part also in that broader kind of network to try and push these things forward, because I think we do have a lot to be positive about in Ireland. And sometimes after spending 2 hours describing the difficulties, it can feel controversial to say that. But I think we look at public opinion in Ireland towards migration that has been polled and is verifiable. There are negatives, absolutely. There are 25% of the population that have, what those of us in this conversation would view as being really problematic attitudes towards people from a migrant background, people from diverse backgrounds. That's a fact, that's real. But also what we have to look at is that 60 to 75% of the Irish population that have quite positive, extremely positive for some, marginally positive for others, their attitudes towards migration and diversity. We're the majority. Those people that are online screaming abuse, they're the minority. the negatives, the trolls, the guys that are out there undermining everything and doing it wrapped in the Irish flag. They're not representative of the majority in Ireland, but sometimes it can seem that they are. So I think that those of us that are in that majority that want to do this, that want to figure this out and work together to do it, we have to do everything in our power. But we also need the political structures, the funding structures, the civil service, the national action plans on migration and things like that, and anti-racism. We need them to exist because we can't do it in a vacuum. We can't do it in a void, and we can't be not supported to do it. That's why things like the Migrant Integration Strategy are so important, and that we take the next opportunity, the next iteration of that, to really embed it, to go further, to look at the things that worked in the first strategy and build upon them, to look at the things that didn't work and go, right, we have to sort that out, and we really have to sort it out, and then measure impact and measure effectiveness and measure the impact of these things, and develop things like the National Strategy Against Racism, which, as Joe identified earlier on, I should call him Minister, as Minister O'Brien identified earlier on, we haven't had a national strategy in 13 years around that. So there's so many different component parts. But what I think is really exciting is the ability to pull all those component parts together and to do it in a meaningful way. So I thank you for your expertise and your time, and I thank you for your input this morning, and to those that are watching, I thank you for joining us. The next webinar, which Robert is very succinctly putting up, is from 2 to 3 p.m, which looks at identity and belonging, and it's still possible to register for that, and we have a great panel in that session as well. And as I said, 9 sessions throughout this week, which I think will be equally as engaging and kind of invigorating. So thank you all for your time. Sorry for keeping you longer than 12 o'clock, but I didn't do too bad. It's only 12:05, so we're going all right. So thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you in the other seminars this week. And thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you, Brian. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.